All right. Hello, Humber students. Welcome back to Reorientation. Thank you for watching our video. We know having classes fully online is definitely a change for you, but online reorientation was created to help you with tips, information, and to better connect with each other online. My name is Nikki, and I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I'm an orientation senior leader, and I just finished my second year in a bachelor's of HR. I'm also your host for Reorientation, so you'll probably see me in other workshops, and I'm excited to be here with you today. Welcome to the What's Your Pleasure workshop. Running this workshop today is Erin.
Hey.
So thank you so much. And now I'm going to just mute my mic and close my camera.
Hello, my name is Erin Brown. I am the coordinator for sexual violence prevention and education at Humber College and the University of Guelph-Humber. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And today we're going to talk a bit about consent, sex, and what it means in COVID-19 and how we can kind of exist in this strange world that we're in right now. And so to get started, assuming my slides want to work, perfect. So I want to just let folks know a bit about what we do with regards to sexual violence prevention and education at Humber College and the University of Guelph-Humber. And so we have our Consent Peer Education program, which we call CPEP. So this is 8 student leaders who create different events and initiatives to increase awareness and understanding of consent and sexual violence on campus. And we do have social media, so you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at CPEP Team. These folks will be creating a bunch of different events for you throughout the year, for the fall semester focusing on in the online portion. So we really encourage you to connect with our social media. Another piece that we do is this program called Bringing in the Bystander, which is a workshop to teach bystander intervention skills to students, staff, and faculty. And we've provided this in many classes and to student leaders across the institution, so really making sure that our folks are equipped to intervene in instances. And then some other initiatives that we have include Take Back the Night, which is a march that typically happens in September each year in solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. We do an event called 1 Billion Rising, which again is this really kind of political piece in supporting survivors of sexual violence. We work with a nursing course every year with some placements, and so they help us do some different education events throughout the college. And we also have our task force on preventing and responding to sexual violence, which involves students, staff, and faculty from across the institution. And so as a whole institution, we're really trying to think of all the different ways that we need to be considering sexual violence to ensure that Humber is a place that is safe for all folks. Why are we so focused on consent? Why is this something that every college and university and folks are really trying to talk about more and more? There was a study that was done that highlighted that 96% of Canadians agree that sexual activity must be consensual, yet only 1 out of 3 Canadians know what consent is. And so we know that there's a disconnect between our understanding of, yes, we need to have it, and what is the it that we need to actually have. And so I want to provide just a brief understanding of what consent is for folks. So sexual consent is essential, and we like to consider some of the different factors that involve someone's ability to give consent or not. One that folks I think are really common with is this idea of it being vocal. So it's not the absence of a no. Someone needs to give us some sort of indication that they actually want to participate in something, and we can't just make an assumption. It's continual, so it can be revoked at any point in time. And so that means that, if I am making out with someone and at some point I'm just like, I'm not feeling it anymore, I'm allowed to stop, right? And there's no assumption that I need to keep participating in this. And similarly, when it's continual, we also need to be mindful of that. When we're moving from one sexual activity to another, we need to be checking in with our partner or partners to see if they're still interested in participating. I think about consent as being something that can also be really fun. I think often when folks think about consent, they sort of, I feel like there's always like this like stiff robot voice that people have where it's like, can I touch you here? Or may I do this? And people seem to think it's really awkward and uncomfortable. But I think there's actually a lot of room for it to be something that is fun, to show our enthusiasm. We bring in a guest speaker usually every year, and one of the things that he talks about is one of the ways that he will ask his wife for consent. And he says, "What would you like me to do to you tonight?" Which I think is just like such a smooth, sexy way of asking that. And I think that's a way to really almost build that into foreplay, right? So it can be really enjoyable for folks. Consent needs to be sober. So it can't be given if a person is incapacitated by alcohol or drugs. Folks will often ask, well, what happens if both people are drinking or high or whatever? And so if one person can't consent when they're under the influence, adding another person who's under the influence does not make consent appear. That's not how that works. And when we've been engaging in alcohol or we've been taking different substances, it affects our ability to make certain decisions. It's the same reason why folks can't drive when high or drunk, right? Our decision making is impaired, and so we don't have that same ability to consent. Now, folks will also ask, what happens if people do engage though? Like, I've been in relationships and I've had sex with someone while I've been drinking and it's been great and it's been fine. And so to that, I would say, yes, we know that people have sex while drinking or under the influence of substances. For me, what I think about is that there is an increased likelihood that someone will have regretted participating in that activity if they've been under the influence. And there's also a difference between, me having a sip of beer and me having 2 glasses of wine. Like 1 glass of wine is enough to take me out, right? And so my ability to consent really changes depending on the amount of alcohol that I've taken. And I think about, the folks that I see who have had so much to drink that they're stumbling, right? Like that is someone who's not in the capacity to consent. And so that's really something that we need to be thinking about and really checking in on. Someone needs to be conscious in order to give consent. So if someone is sleeping or unconscious for any other means, they're unable to give us that vocal yes. They're unable to indicate to us that they want to participate. We talk about consent being between peers, and that there can't be a position of authority. And so the reason for this is that someone who's in a position of authority has some degree of power over you, some degree of control. And so you might feel obligated to participate. An example of this would be if a professor wanted to engage in some sort of sexual behavior with a student. Because that professor controls that student's grades and their academic performance, even if that student is maybe interested, they can't truly consent because at any point that professor can use their power against that student. And so it's an unfair relationship. And so it needs to be between peers. It needs to be clear, so it can't be assumed or implied. And so just because someone is, sending you all these flirty emojis and that sort of thing, and like the wink emoji and the eggplant emoji or whatever, does not necessarily mean that when you two meet in person, that you want to engage in some sort of behavior, or even that they want to, if you're not meeting in person, send any photos or engage in any sort of online or digital behavior. So we need to make sure that we're getting a real clear indication from someone that they're interested in participating. Consent needs to be present in a relationship. So dating someone doesn't mean that consent is automatically there. I don't think that anyone wants to have sex or engage in sexual activity 24/7, because that just sounds exhausting, truthfully, right? We just don't have the energy for that. We need rest, we have other needs. And so recognizing that even if we're in a relationship with someone, and yes, we seem to enjoy having sex with one another or other activities, it doesn't mean we want to do that all the time. I think about if I have a stomach ache, it ain't gonna happen. Sorry, I'm taking care of myself right now. And lastly, it needs to be given freely, so it can never be obtained through threats or coercion. And so an example of this would be if someone said, if you don't do this with me, I'm going to share these photos of you, or I'm going to break up with you. That's someone putting pressure on you and trying to bully you into participating into this activity. And so you're not giving an honest consent when you participate because you feel obligated to. Right? So these are all these different factors that we need to be considering when we're engaging in sexual activity. And the important thing with this is really being mindful of who's the partner that we're with or the partners that we're with, and what is affecting their ability to consent or not? What pressures are at play here? And so I think that's really important for us. But I also want to highlight that consent isn't the goal, right? That's the bare minimum for a sexual activity with someone. We need consent. I want us to reframe this and really start thinking as a society, not just about consent, but about pleasure, and how do we have a mutually pleasurable sexual experience? And consent helps get us there, right? So I think that's really important. And how do we talk about pleasure? We need to talk about our boundaries. We need to communicate what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with. And so ways that we can do this is we can ask the person that we're with different questions. So, we can say, can I send you photos? Can I touch you here? What's your comfort level with anal? What positions do you prefer? Are you open to trying blank? And those are ways that once we're starting to talk with someone and engage with them, we're really starting to get an understanding of what they're interested in and what would bring them pleasure and what they're probably more likely to want to consent to. And similarly, they should be asking these questions of us, and we should be sharing that as well. Once you start to understand these different boundaries, you're able to have a much more enjoyable sexual experience with someone. And so let's talk about sex. Let's make it about our partner and not ourselves. And so here's some examples. I just want you to think about the difference between these two pieces here. So saying, I want to touch your blank versus how would it feel if I touched your blank? In that first one, I'm really only thinking about what I want and what would be enjoyable for me. And I'm not really considering the other person's feelings there. Whereas if I'm asking someone, how would it feel? I get to know whether that would be something that they would enjoy or not. And I think for that person, it's really affirming to have that taken into account. Similarly, we want to pay attention to someone's body language and nonverbal cues and think about the differences in those. And so someone who is leaning in, pulling you closer, making lots of eye contact is probably enjoying what they're doing. Whereas someone who's backing off is maybe avoiding eye contact with you or pushes your hand away, is kind of closing off a bit. That's someone who's probably not enjoying what's happening. And so you're going to want to talk to them and say, hey, what's up? This is something that I'm noticing. How are you doing? And checking in with your partner is a really important piece. And then again, setting boundaries. I like when you touch me here. I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with that. Or let's use blank as a safe word. A safe word is something that indicates that when we're saying that during a sexual activity, that's the very clear indication that, okay, we're going to stop. And so that's something that's really important. So now that we've talked a bit about consent and we've talked about pleasure, I want to talk a bit about what we do during this time of a global pandemic. Wild, right? And so I want to talk a bit about digital sexual behaviors and then in-person sexual behaviors, because I think a lot of folks have questions about this. And so we're actually seeing a lot of increase in folks engaging in sexting, engaging in content over webcams and video calls and that sort of thing, which I think is really great. And folks are exploring different ways to ensure that they are meeting their sexual needs. But some things that we really need to be mindful of is that before we are sending any photos or videos, we're asking before sending, right? That's really important. We can't assume that someone wants to see our photo. Trust me, as someone who is on Grindr and receives a lot of photos that I don't want to receive, it's not appreciated. And someone asking first is really important because then we know whether someone wants to receive that or not. We need to be mindful about our own safety as well when we're engaging in the online world. And so this is not to say don't do that. I think that engaging in sexual activity through the digital space is actually a really important piece for folks right now and can be really satisfying. But we need to make sure that we're doing things like keeping our face and identifying features such as tattoos out of photos and videos whenever possible. I'm a person that I have like tattoos down my arms. I have a tattoo on my back. I have a tattoo on my ankle. I plan to get a lot more as soon as this pandemic is over. But for me, if I'm ever sending photos to someone, I'm making sure that those aren't on display in the photos, because as much as I am trusting that person with those, I just don't know what might happen. I don't know if someone's going to hack the iCloud or whatever, and all those sorts of things. And so those are ways that I'm able to manage my own online safety. And I would encourage you folks to consider that as well. And I think it's also just a really important piece to be exploring methods you feel comfortable with. So thinking about whether you want to be doing photos, videos, video calls. Sometimes folks just want to do phone calls and talk over the phone. Other folks actually just want to text. And I think that there can also be something that's super satisfying about that, right? And having that dialogue over text about what you would do to one another and what that sexual experience would look like. So those are some ways that we can really be mindful of meeting our intimacy needs while thinking about someone else's pleasure and consenting here as well. I want to talk about the in-person sex piece as well. There's obviously a lot of communication right now from public health officials about isolating and not engaging with other folks that are not within our immediate bubble. And so often that's our families, our roommates, or whomever we are living with. And so, yes, that is one of our ways to ensure that we don't get COVID-19, or at least reduce our risk of getting it. But I also recognize that folks have sexual needs and intimacy needs. And for some folks, that also then affects their mental health and their well-being in so many other ways. For some folks, meeting out with other people is part of ceremony and is part of spiritual needs. And so when we are choosing to engage in in-person sexual activity during COVID-19, I think some of the things that we really need to be considering is sticking to people that we know and that we trust is a really important piece. I think that that's one of those ways that we can maintain our safety there. Because if we don't know the person, we don't always know to the degree that we can trust them to have been isolating, to have been taking precautions, to have been using, that personal protective equipment. And so that's really important. We would also want to potentially limit our number of partners. And so, you might trust and know a larger group of people, and you might have a variety of folks that you're engaging in sexual behavior with. But I think about then, you're connected to that person and that person and that person who's then connected to other people. And that's just where, again, we're increasing our exposure to potentially getting COVID-19. And so you might want to limit who your partners are and think about, maybe there's 2 or 3 that we're going to stick to. So that's an important piece there. And then I think we really need to, again, be having these honest conversations about our isolating or lack thereof if we haven't been isolating. And that's a really important piece. And one of the things that we sometimes talk about with consent as well is disclosing our STI status, so sexually transmitted infections. And so if we have a sexually transmitted infection, that's something that we typically would want to share with someone before we engage in sexual activity with them, so that they can make an informed decision about that, and that we're not knowingly putting that person's health at risk. And so this is a very similar situation where we, again, want to be really mindful of disclosing whether we have been engaging in risky behaviors with relation to COVID-19 if we're going to be engaging with folks in sexual activity in person. So those are some of the considerations that I wanted to highlight for folks. There are some really, really great articles out there that I encourage you to take a look into. Toronto Public Health has put out a lot of great information about tips and strategies to ensure your safety when meeting sexual needs during COVID-19. And I think more and more we're starting to see a call for greater information from public health officials around how we can meet our sexual intimacy needs during COVID-19 and not necessarily doing the abstinence only approach for that. So that's something to also think about and look into. Those are the pieces that I wanted to chat about with you today. And so at this point, I'll just see if there are any questions that folks who are here might have. But if not, we can leave it at that. And you folks can always reach out via email to me as well. We'll make sure that that's in the description for you folks on YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Erin, and thank you to those of you watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at orientation@humber.ca. Ta-da!